So, today is another review, and that is going to be for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Sage, what do you think about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth?
This is an interesting one. I was curious to ask. You played the remake that came out a few like 4 years ago now.
Yes, I did.
And did you play it all the way to the end or just part way?
Just part way.
Okay. So part of the setup for this game revolves around the fact that in the remake part one or just remake, however you want to refer to it, that game, 90% of it was a remake of Final Fantasy VII, right? But there were these small pieces that built up to this big conclusion at the end. Spoilers for part one of this remake trilogy, but the characters end up fighting like fate itself and stepping out of the kind of predetermined timeline of the original game, which creates like a split. So, like the opening scene of this game is you're jumping back and forth between two worlds. One world where Zack, the character from like the Crisis Core spinoff of Final Fantasy VII, is alive, and like Tifa, Barrett, and like pretty much the rest of the crew all died at the end of the game. And then a second world, which is kind of your main one, where you play as the whole crew. Everybody got out. Zack is dead like he's supposed to be. And you jump back and forth between these two different worlds, slowly at first, and then over the course of the story, you really start to get into what's going on with these multiple kind of layers of reality. I almost think the subtitle for this game could have been Into the Final Fantasy VII verse, because we start to get to that point of kind of zany kind of multiverse stuff here with this game, which some people don't love. Some people really were hoping it would just be a pretty straightforward remake of the original. Other people, like I think I would say I'd land in the second category, where that's such an iconic game. If you're going to do a remake, why not do something a little weird and fresh with it here so that it's not just the same thing? But at the same time, I also think like probably a good 80% of this game still feels like you are following the events of the original. It's just kind of big moments, and especially at the end where we start to diverge and showcase a little bit of a different story. Um, but if for any reason, when you played the remake, one of your thoughts maybe you didn't get all the way through because hey, this is I've seen this, but it's cool, but hey, I've seen this before. There is new stuff there. That maybe motivating for some people to go through and finish it all the way. But how does this stack up as a sequel? I think is probably the biggest question. And I think this is one of those where it's a marketable difference over the last one. A few things about the last game that maybe bugged me. I don't know about you, but it was very linear. You were kind of railroaded down corridors for most of the game, and there's a few spots where it opens up and there's a couple side missions you can do, a little couple town squares, but then you kind of just go back to being going through a series of corridors. And here that's completely overhauled. You are let out into the whole world. You have this massive open world to explore at your leisure. If you want to just follow the main story, you can do that. If you want to explore and do side quests, you can do that. You got a much more classic RPG feel. It feels closer to the original in that sense. The first part of this trilogy only covered maybe the first 5 hours of the original game. This covers a much more substantial uh, amount of time of that. So whether you feel like it's still being padded and stretched out, which I think at times it kind of is. I do think it's a big negative for me that this does suffer a little bit from the open world fatigue that I think a lot of people feel in video games right now. There's so many mini games. There's so many side quests, and they don't necessarily all feel significant. I think it's not as bad as say like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I've complained about a whole lot for just having like 8 million objective markers that and they're like the same 10 things over and over. There is more variety here in your side content. It's not quite as repetitive as that, but it's definitely not as concise as it could be. In part, that's an answer. It's designed that way as an answer to the last game not having enough side content. So it's a balance. Hopefully, the third one can maybe strike that perfect medium. But I do think it is still a better attempt at solving that than the first game was. Um, Graphically, I mean, this is probably one of the best games out right now. Square Enix has always been good with their visuals, so and this game is gorgeous to look at. If you're a fan of the original, if you played the original, it's really cool to see all of these things updated and shown in such high fidelity. Um, the whole world itself to specific story sequences. I think if you have played the original, I'm not going to say too specifically, but if you were to guess where this ended to cut off to the third one, I feel like you'd probably be right on your first guess. But yeah, I don't know. I think that this is a big improvement over the last one in almost every single way. I just wish that maybe it wasn't 100 hours long to do everything because I started to feel the length by the end of it. As much as I think that the majority of this works, I did start to feel the length. And there's also another negative too I want to bring up is there's a few story sequences where it's not quite a cutscene, but it's not quite gameplay, where you're doing some like quick time events almost, button prompts like you're slowly crawling across the ground and you have to press a trigger to move each arm, very slowly. And some of those moments feel like they want you to feel like you have a cinematic engagement, but also player agency at the same time. And you kind of end up feeling like it doesn't get either of those things. But that's just how I felt about
Okay. So, some of the negatives for you would be some of the open world, kinda aspects of the game there, feeling a little too stuffed, a little too over bloated there.
it. Yeah, I think there's just so much of it. I mean, I also think, there's something to be said for this game probably is meant to be played for most people over the course of a much greater length of time than I played it. Whereas I sat down, I really tried to play this pretty quickly and try and work through it all pretty fast. So that there may have been just some personal burnout on it that I'm willing to acknowledge. But I also think that, there's a lot of side quests where it's just like, oh, here's a hunt for a mythical creature. And it's not that that's not fun, but I think there's just, a certain amount of like, I would like to keep some pace with the story here, especially, there's a lot of games where it feels like there's kind of a crunch for time and like, hey, we're on this quest and we got to get here quickly because the world's going to end. And then, you could spend, 40 hours of that game kind of just doing random stuff and walking away from what is supposedly this time sensitive mission objective. And that's just it's a thing I think that's just a little inherent to some open world video games where if you're going to give your player agency to your audience, it's going to clash with that story element just a little bit. It's not too bad. It's just something I noticed because I was trying to play as much of the side content as possible. I didn't want to ignore it. If I'm going to come talk about it on here and do a review for it, I want to engage with as much of the game as I can. And I just think they just went a little overboard with that stuff. Just a little too much of it. And then also just some of those cutscene moments where it's like you can just make this a cutscene. You don't need me to like press the shoulder buttons slowly for 5 minutes straight to make this engaging. Like it would be more engaging to just watch it.
Okay. So, what would be your rating for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth?
Um, I'm going to give it a strong, like a high tune in. A high tune in. I think it's one of those things. Like I said, personal burnout on open world design. I totally do think affected me just a little bit, but I could see how this would be a peak for a lot of people if you maybe just played it over a little bit more time. But that being said, I think the narrative here is handled very well. I like the new stuff that they're doing with the story. I think that the kind of it's not just a remake, it's kind of a sequel element to it. That worked really well for me. I thought that's some of the best parts of the game, honestly, is when they went off script from the original. But yeah, just a few things like open world design that I'm just I'm a little fatigued by in general, and some of that just holds it back a little bit. But I will say the gameplay loop really fun, the combat itself really fun. They also made fighting like airborne enemies a lot smoother because that was kind of annoying in the last one. They totally fixed that. They looked at the criticism people had of the previous game, and pretty much every single thing people didn't like, they looked at and said, how can we improve this for our audience? And that's kind of what you want in a sequel, right? That's kind of what makes a great sequel is you take what worked, you shave off a bit of what didn't, you add stuff. Maybe not all of that new stuff works, but you can tell that they were listening to feedback in a way that I thought was notable, and it showed that there was a lot of effort put into this.
All right. So you gave it a peak?
I'd
Or
give it a high tune in, like not like almost a peak, but I also think this will be a peak for a lot of people.
okay.